Here today talking to Mohsin Hamid. His novels mean a great deal to me and a great deal to many people I know. Of course, he needs no introduction to you all. I will just say there's a quality to his work that it seems to be right of the moment and timely in many ways, and yet it's extraordinarily timeless. And I feel that his novels will be read for just about as long as people read novels. As you know, he's written four. His new one, Exit West, is just out. Is it out here now?
There are a few copies here. Hopefully they haven't yet finished. Yeah, it comes out next week.
Okay. And of course, as you know, he was born here in Lahore, educated in the United States at Harvard Law School, and before that, Princeton. Now lives in Lahore once again. Your new novel, Mohsin, Exit West, which I read on the flight here, and there's something about flying that is sort of subtly sad and apocalyptic sometimes when you're flying between continents, and reading his novel while feeling sad and apocalyptic, because his novel is, I would say, sad and apocalyptic and beautiful, really sort of got to me, and it's a very soulful novel. And I would describe it quickly as a love story set against the end of the world. And the term exit is a very loaded term in this book. Can you talk about the title and the word exit and what it means in this book?
Well, first of all, thank you for that very generous introduction. And also, before we begin, I'd like to say thank you to Dwight for coming here. And also, I think for so many of our guests who've come from abroad, the events of the last couple of weeks have been difficult and tragic, and the fact that you've come. So I'd love it if our Lahore audience could give Dwight a round of applause. You know, it's these connections that we make of people coming together and being in a public place together, in a place like Lahore in particular, depend on lots of things, but they also depend on sort of just a human level courage, I would say, to come to Pakistan despite what people say about Pakistan. And so I and so many people I've talked to who've already met you are really grateful that you're here. Now, on Exit West, as far as the title is concerned, there are, as you say, multiple notions going on. On the one hand, Exit West is a story of a young couple, Saeed and Nadia, who wind up moving west, first to Europe and then to America, to California. And where they begin is not entirely clear, but it's some place that looks a lot like Lahore and is undergoing circumstances perhaps a lot like Aleppo. It's not a named city. And so Exit West is a story of people exiting west. But it's also a story about the exiting of the idea of the West. When all of these people move, is the West still the West? The West strikes me already as at least largely imaginary concept. But I think it's becoming even more so. At this moment we're sitting geographically in the East, but are we in the East? You're here, I'm here, and if you and I were sitting in New York, are we suddenly in the West? Ideas and people move. So the novel is about a movement and also about a movement of an idea.
Did you begin this novel? When did you start writing it, and what was playing out in the world as you were writing it, and was it hard not to pay attention to the news? How distracting is the news of the last year or so? Anyhow, can you talk a bit about the genesis of this book and how you wrote it?
Well, when I returned to Lahore about 7-ish years ago, and I'm sure many people who've been abroad and come back have experienced this, one of the first things that struck me was how many of my friends, acquaintances, strangers I would talk to about the move would say, are you crazy? Why have you done this? Why come back to Pakistan from London? And it's not, I think, until you come back that you realize how strong the push is in the other direction. My cable repair guy was saying, he was asking the story as he was installing my cable and then fixing my cable. And he talked about how he wanted to leave Pakistan and how the cable company was outsourcing this repair function and now he's not making enough money and he wants to go to Dubai. And the sense of this huge pressure of people who want to leave where they are, particularly in the global south, and how there are billions of people who feel like that. And then imagining, as the environment changes and sea levels rise and rainfalls fail, the scale of migration is likely to happen. I wanted to write about that. So that was part of the genesis for the book. The other part of the genesis for the book was I've moved around my whole life. So I went to California when I was 3 and back to Pakistan at 9 and then America at 18 and London at 30 and back to Pakistan in my late 30s. And so I wanted to write a novel about migration, but not as a single journey, but as a lifelong experience. And then the last thing, which I'm sure we'll get to, was I was struck by this notion, having a conversation with somebody, over Skype, and surfing the internet on my phone, that there are already these little windows around us where we can kind of look at this object and see some other world on the other side. That we're already, as you are going to step through a door in the next day or so, and within less than a day, be back in New York City, halfway around the world. And I felt that there was an emotional reality to people being able to move, at least in their minds and sometimes in their bodies, that felt enormously true and powerful. And that began to become part of the idea for this book.
One of the reasons your books are so powerful, for me at any rate, is that they are so remarkably cosmopolitan. There's a sense that you know a great deal about much of the world, many parts of the world, many different parts that sort of you fold into your work, and they blend seamlessly. How important is it? I'm struck by how many writers are in the crowd and how many people are already writers or are writing or want to be writing. How important is it to be well-traveled, to be a good fiction writer?
I think you have to be well-traveled to be a good fiction writer. I just don't think you necessarily need to move. So one thing which books allow us to do is to travel, in a sense. I think, I've never been to Russia, but I have a certain degree of intimacy with it, at least with it of 150 years ago. And I think of Pakistani weddings and family politics in, sometimes late 19th century Russian terms, because of the writers that I've read. And so I think that being able to move beyond your immediate context is important for a writer, is almost the fundamental. If there are two fundamental attributes to writing, one is working with words, and the other is journeying beyond your physical reality. In my case, physical travel has very much helped, but there was a long time when I moved back to Pakistan at the age of 9 and didn't go anywhere, stayed here, didn't travel abroad, that most of that travel was happening for me in books. And some of the places I was going to had never existed, Narnia, Middle-earth, these sorts of places. Yep. And yes, I think that is important.
When you travel abroad, do you find that that your readership, Pakistani Americans, do they have the same reactions to your fiction that people who live here have to them? Do you find, how is that readership, how does your fiction sink in to both crowds?
Well, the interesting thing that I've discovered is that when you start looking closely at ideas like a Pakistani reader or a Pakistani American reader or an American reader who is not Pakistani American, and you start talking to people, those ideas very quickly shimmer and disappear and they're replaced by just a bunch of different individuals. So if we were to go around, the people in this room right now and to say, so what do you think about fiction and what do you like? There would be 200 or 300 or 400 different answers. And so I've given up on trying to think about how Pakistani Americans or Pakistanis might think about something, because they are as, unlikely. In the same way that if you were to go to America, you could arrive in one America today where people are celebrating the election of Donald Trump and some of his pronouncements. and another America where people are thinking of it as the worst catastrophe to have befallen America in modern history. So that degree of difference is everywhere.
You're about to fly into a new America. How aware of that are you? What are you told by people you know and respect there about what awaits you?
Well, I think that it's a strange experience thinking about traveling to America. I mean, in this room, most people will know that it often takes Pakistanis or people who are coming from Pakistan a little bit longer to get into the United States than other people who get off that airplane. So you often wind up in secondary inspection, or you're asked extra questions, or you sit in this room, waiting for additional inquiries to happen. And that could very well happen on this time. But there's two differences. One is there's a real fear that in me that the fear of what I am presumably representing has grown much stronger. And because that fear has grown stronger, the kinds of inquiries that I'll be subjected to will be more intense. Give me your mobile phone, unlock it for me.
Are you expecting that?
I don't know. I mean, I am actively thinking about, I did actively think about, should I take my original phone and should I take my original computer? For the simple reason that it was, not that I have anything to hide necessarily, but the stuff on there is private. I don't really feel entirely comfortable with the idea that I have to unlock it and pass it over, or that perhaps it goes away for half an hour, the data gets replicated, it sits on some server. If it isn't of use, in theory it's wiped, but perhaps it isn't, and my children's photographs are there, and my life moments are there, and that's very disconcerting. And then separately, there's the potential, I think very, very small, hopefully, that somebody will say, no, you can't come in part because we are giving to people who are supposed to protect us more and more arbitrary power. And maybe by and large they won't abuse that power, but somebody could have a bad day or just not like you, and you never know.
No, I hear you. Different question. I am a book critic for the New York Times. You're about to arrive in the States, where your book will be. It's released Tuesday?
A week. It's on the 7th, I think, 7th of March.
I mean, I know the New York Times is reviewing your book on Tuesday. I'm not writing about it. I wish I were, because I adore it. What is it like anticipating? How much do you read your reviews, first of all? Do you ever learn anything from them? Or what's it like sort of anticipating the rollout as you move across the world, reading people's critics' impressions of your novel?
It has depended. Early on I read a lot of my reviews, and then I read less reviews, and then I read more reviews. My preferred approach right now is if my editors think a review is particularly insightful or interesting, they'll email it over, and then I'll ask my wife Zara to read it, and then she might read out a few choice excerpts. I think I will read some reviews, but I might not read them in the moment of publication. I'd rather separate out my own anxieties about how this book is being received from what a thoughtful critic can offer me in terms of understanding of my book, and do it in two separate phases. So let's put it into the world, see what happens, and then later come back and see what was said.
Is there a critical establishment here in Pakistan? Do you get many reviews of your book here?
I mean, my books are reviewed in the local newspapers, but I think many people here are very candid and will offer me a 30-second review, as I'm walking by them on the street or at a wedding or at a party, and so you get lots of feedback. There's less of a deep book reviewing culture and an environment for that here, perhaps, but it's changing. And also, of course, many Pakistanis will write for publications that are not based in Pakistan, or for websites that are not based in Pakistan. So I think it's deepening. And one of the things that I find most interesting is I meet lots of young academics who are doing their masters or their PhDs. And they're engaging with the works of Pakistani writers as Pakistanis. And there, of course, you're talking about a very intense level of engagement. Again, I don't necessarily read those, but I have conversations, and I do learn from how somebody is thinking of what I've done and what their approach to my work is.
Some writer once said that that a bit of criticism from a critic they don't respect at all, something a ridiculous human being will write something, it will stay in their mind the rest of their life, while as there have been 400 positive reviews that were beautifully written. It's that one little thing. Do you have one or two of those things that sort of someone put in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely have memories of the wince or the pain of those things. I don't remember the passages necessarily that stung so clearly, not anymore. I mean, maybe after a few months I'll remember some much more clearly. But there's a reason for that, and it actually has to do with a lot of politics as well. We're animals, and in nature, if something can harm us, our entire mental, emotional system is designed to respond very strongly to that possibility of harm, because we could cease to exist. If that little yellow thing behind the tree is actually a lion, I better freak out. I shouldn't say, well, there's almost no chance it's a lion, and then I'll be eaten. And so people, I think, are built to be easily startled or hurt emotionally. At least I tell myself that to think I'm not some sort of freak. But yeah, I think unkind things stay in the memory much more than kind things.
Your career is fascinating to me and to many people, having gone to Harvard Law School and then worked in business after that for a while. Can you take us back to when you were working McKinsey & Company, right? And a very serious major corporation in America, consulting work. How did you know you had the first novel in you, Moth Smoke? How did you get the energy? How did you get the courage to pull yourself away from your career doing this to start writing that book?
Well, it didn't take courage. It was more a kind of obsession. So I began Moth Smoke in 1993 when I was about 21 years old. And I took a year off after college to work on it, and I worked on it through law school, which is 3 more years. Then I arrived in New York with a job, and I kept working on it. I never really thought it was possible to write books for a living. I'm still not entirely sure that I do, but I always thought I'd have to have a job and make a living somehow. And so when I was working in New York and working at McKinsey, I had been working on Moth Smoke for several years, and I really wanted to finish this book. It took 7 years, that book. The first 2 each took 7 years. Making time, I was younger, I didn't have a family, so I had weekends, I had nights, I had a lot of energy. It got done.
People speak of Harvard Law School as one of the most intense experiences of their lives, and it's supposedly all-consuming. You found time. How did you do it? Did you get up early?
I think as Razi will tell you that the intensity of Harvard Law School is nowhere near as intense as organizing the Lahore Literary Festival. You have to change venue and compress down and deal with, So I thought law school was interesting. The first year, I actually focused a lot on my book and not on my studies very much. And then I realized this is not a good idea, and I studied harder in my second year. I discovered almost immediately upon arriving at Harvard Law School that I didn't want to practice law. I hadn't realized what a professional school was and how different a professional school was from a liberal arts education. But when I found myself in it, I somehow was immediately uncomfortable. But then, as I stuck around, I found that there was something quite interesting about the law, in that the word is everything. In a contract, in a constitution, in a judgment by a court, those things are made up of words. And precisely what word is used where has every significance in the world. And so they're not unrelated, actually. The idea of being a fiction writer and being somebody who thinks in a legal way. There's a relationship between the two. And so I found stuff that interested me.
When did you first really know that you had words, that you were a word person, that you could make words work?
I think so many of us who are writers are never quite sure, and the reason for that is that it's impossible to say what you want. You can come close, but the truth is that when we use words, there's this world around us, which actually, well, one thinks exists, and then there are these words that are an attempt to render that world into something else. In the same way, that a song about an ocean isn't an ocean, or a painting about the moon isn't the moon.
Right.
Words can't be. And for me, it wasn't so much that I felt like, oh, I have words. I felt this enormous desire to communicate stuff that felt very difficult to me to communicate. As a little kid, moving between countries and cultures, there was lots of stuff that I just wanted to get out and didn't know how. And it's still sort of what I'm doing now.
Some writers are magpies. They're collecting all the time, writing down things, information, thinking about the next book, writing down favorite words and phrases and bits of information, and they sort of work that way. Other writers, I think Philip Roth has said that he sits down and writes a novel, just sits down and starts writing without really knowing where he's going. Which kind are you, if you're more one or the other?
Maybe a little bit of both. Probably more the second than the first, but definitely also the first. And also it depends on the book. I'm always writing stuff down or typing stuff in. There are always ideas that are coming to me and phrasings and little things. But and when I'm writing a novel, usually I'll have a Word document open and I'll be typing on whatever part I'm typing as far as I've gotten. And after that will be 1, 2, 10, 20, 30 pages of just stuff. It could be an outline, it could be just random things, it could be musings that I hope to incorporate as I go. And I guess that's the magpie part of it.
Okay. Exit West is a terrific title. I love stories about the things that writers almost called their books. Did you have it early, or were there other possible titles that you rejected?
There were other possible titles. I had it very late. There was another title which I felt very strongly about.
You have to tell us what it was.
Well, it's dangerous because who knows? I want to use these titles later. But at one point, I thought of calling Exit West All Migrants Through Time. All Migrants Through Time, which is a phrase that occurs in the novel and is something. But that didn't meet with enormous love from my U.S. Publisher in particular, and then began this search, and which is interesting for me because Maud Smoke was called Maud Smoke, Russian Fundamentalist was called Russian Fundamentalist, How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia was called that, although there was a subtitle which got axed along the way. This is the first time I came forth with a title from one of my novels and found, pushback. And so then there was a mad search, and every day my wife would have to listen to me sort of saying, and what about this, and what about this, and what about this, and she said, aren't those exactly the same? I said, no, this one has an S at the end, and this one has a the, and this one has a, and really it was riffing with her that Exit West came about. I think she probably has more credit for the title than I do.
Speaking about your wife and working at home, can you tell us about your process? Are you one of those writers who needs to work every morning from 6 to 10, or are you one of those people who goes in spurts where you work intensely for 3 weeks and then? How disciplined are you?
I wrote Maud Smoke mainly between midnight and 6 in the morning, I'd say, and it probably reads like that. And now I write when the kids are at school, which is 8 or 9 in the morning until about 1.
Do you have to have a certain number of words per day, or is sitting there enough?
If I have 5 or 6 words, it's a pretty good day.
This is a short novel you're doing.
Yeah. Well, one of my agents once called me the reluctant novelist because it's like 7 years and this little tiny book comes out. But the Israeli novelist Amos Oz had this wonderful Paris Review interview, I think it was, where he said that every day he's like a shopkeeper. And he sits at his desk, and that's opening the shop. And then he waits for somebody to come and buy something from his shop. Some days, nobody comes to buy anything. And then at 5 o'clock, he shuts the shop and his workday is done. And he said, for him, being a writer is just opening the shop every day. It's not what you wrote. And I think there's something to that. I maybe don't succeed on opening my shop every day, but if I've spent 4 or 5 hours with the shop open, even sitting there, going backwards, ending the day with less words than I began, which happens very often, it's a good work day.
Do you have rituals, superstitions? Do you like to do certain things every morning in the same way when you're working well? I know writers who have the one coffee mug or tea mug they have to use every time if the work is going well. I don't know if you have anything like that.
I don't have superstitions exactly, but I definitely, I can see certain dangers. I know certain weaknesses. One of those weaknesses is if when I sit down at my computer, instead of clicking on my word processor and beginning work, I click on my web browser and begin looking at stuff, it's entirely possible that day I will do no writing at all. And I know this, but I still sometimes click on the web browser.
I asked this earlier. Has it become harder for writers like yourself to go and sit and knowing that the world is sort of on fire, one click away, and you can read Twitter, read the news? Do you have to sort of really shut that off to get work done?
For me, not so much, because I'm, I think, partly writing because of those things. So my writing is at least in part response to all the stuff that freaks me out outside of myself. So, you know, if things are bad in Lahore, or if a crazy election has happened in America, it doesn't necessarily mean that I won't write. It might mean I write much more. I'm feeling oddly energized post the US election, even though I'm also very depressed, because the importance of writing is sort of coming back to me.
Yeah, yeah. Do you read fiction while you're writing fiction?
Yeah, I do. I read fiction while I'm writing fiction. I read much more in the year or so when I've finished a novel and haven't started the next one, and I'm out on book tours and things. I actually read a lot in that year. And I probably read about as much in that 1 year in the next 4 or 5 years when I'm writing. But I do read when I'm writing.
Can you give yourself over to a novel, or is your novelist's brain always picking it apart, thinking, that's how he did this or she did this? Or, you know, can you read the way a child reads, the way we all want to read freely still?
I can. And I look for it. I know a lot of writers who are much more actively taking apart the books they read than I am. I tend to do my figuring out of what the book is doing after I've finished. I try not to do it while I'm reading. So sometimes if I really love a book, I'll read it, and I'll have the experience of reading, and then I might go back and read it apart and read it a second time and sort of look at how did it do that. But I try to separate the experiences. But I remember when the film of The Reluctant Fundamentalist was made, and I would get these draft, versions of the film where this scene was, not yet complete, or the music was some filler music, or the special effect wasn't there, or so, things were not fully refined. And watching the film come together in that way made it much more difficult when I saw the finished film to see it as a film.
Right.
And not as a draft.
Right.
And it actually carried over to other films for a while. I was watching other films and seeing how they were put together and thinking, the continuity person got that wrong. He was standing 4 feet from the door, now he's 1 foot from the door. Weird things that I never noticed before. But with books, luckily so far, not as much.
Let's talk about your own drafts. Do you sort of hunker down on your book and not show it to anyone until it's friends or editors or other people things as you're moving along for comment?
I do. I mean, I think I do show it to people for comment. The first person is my wife Zara. I usually show my stuff to, and some family and close friends, my agent and editor. There are people that I show to. Lately, I mean, on the most recent book, I just sort of wrote it. And I guess I show books for different reasons. So sometimes I'm figuring out what is the formal way that this book is built. You know, should Maud Smoke be a surreal trial where this guy is being tried by you, the reader? Should The Reluctant Fundamentalist be a dramatic monologue? Or should it just be a straight story? Should How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia be a self-help book or something else? And when I'm playing around with those forms, I sometimes show what I'm doing just to get a sense of, is this, you know, working? And sometimes the language. But I think a little bit less as I get further along.
Your new novel has a somewhat fable-like quality. I don't want to give away much about the book, but his two lovers travel the world in an unusual way, I will say. And how much were you thinking about that sort of layers in fairy tales while writing this book? Or fables, I would say, not fairy tales.
Well, I think that fables, fairy tales, and children's books have always been things that interested me. I'm a writer today because of children's books. I wouldn't have been a reader if it hadn't been for children's books. And certainly some of the most powerful reading experiences I've ever had were reading children's books. I see my daughter who reads books now, and I see the way they affect her. And you know, there's a lot to be learned. Partly it's because you're a child, but partly it's because the books deal with you like you're a child. And that can be a very generous way of dealing. It isn't necessarily, the good children's books don't talk down to the child. The writer becomes a child as well, playing with the child to a certain extent. And so, yes, that is certainly how I've thought about this book in particular. The first draft of The Reluctant Fundamentalist was also quite fable-like, but then it evolved into a different way. It was actually written before 9/11. So it then evolved in a very different direction. But I think that books can do interesting things with people, that particularly now books have important functions that they can play. You know, that there's a kind of exploration that happens. So, books enter into territory that is also potentially spiritual, or also potentially, about what is or is not wisdom, or these kinds of things. And those sorts of domains have, for a very long period of time, been approached incredibly successfully in fabular or children's literature style ways.
Do you have an ideal reader in mind when you write? Are you trying to entertain yourself, or a friend, or your wife, or is it who do you imagine charming?
I don't really have an imaginary reader exactly in mind. My first three novels each built a superstructure that created a theoretical reader and then wrote for that reader. But that wasn't my intended reader. So Maud Smoke was somebody from Lahore, like me, who's been picked up and thrown into this courtroom and said, judge these people. So it's a Lahori. And Maud Smoke is written about Lahore for Lahoris with a particular way of speaking. But it's not meant only for Lahori people. And The Reluctant Fundamentalist is told to this presumably American stranger who's in Pakistan. And so the way that Pakistan is explained, or things are explained, is for that person. Who isn't the intended reader, but is that's the vantage point from which the architecture of the building takes shape, because it's going to be viewed from here. Now, it's not the only direction you can look at the building from, but it's just that's how you conceive of the structure. And then How to Get Filthy Rich in Rising Asia is about somebody who presumably wants to get filthy rich in Rising Asia.
Yeah.
And so it's written for that person, even though, of course, it isn't intended necessarily for that person. But this book doesn't have a formal superstructure around it that says this is who you are. There isn't a you who is also the reader, or only glancingly so in this book. And there was a you who is the reader in the previous books. And so this time I had to think about a different way of doing it. And in that sense, it was, I think, to a certain extent, children's literature that I had in mind. which was, let's just imagine we can do anything. But let's also build into the book everything required to decode the book. In other words, I didn't want to write a book this time where somebody might read it and be like, I didn't get that. I met so many people in Pakistan in particular who have made me rethink what my notion of readers are. And I'm sure if I was anywhere, I would feel that way.
Yeah.
They're not, readers may not be like me, and they may not be like you. In fact, we are the only two people like us. And so I think for me now, one thing I'm very interested in, in quote-unquote literary fiction is how do you open that up and allow access into the book, have the book build into itself what it wants to do. In other words, how do you let your book say what it intends to say,
right,
as opposed to being, I'm not going to say what I'm intending to say, but I'm going to create a structure which might provoke you to have certain things. Again, not that the book Exit West dictates certain views, but many things that in the past I might not have explained, I've chosen to explain, and that itself results in different ways of writing things.
Well, this is the first novel you've written, I believe, since you've had young children.
Yeah.
And did that affect, reading them books, did that affect the things you were talking about with the
it did. I remember one thing my father-in-law said to me, which has stayed with me. He said, you're a storyteller. That's what people are looking for in your stuff. In some ways, it's the most obvious thing you could possibly say. You're a storyteller. Like, obviously, I'm a storyteller. But on the other hand, it's so easy as a novelist to forget that is, and not everybody would agree that that's a core function of a novelist, but even if you do agree, it's easy to forget that and think, no, I'm actually somebody, I'm somebody who designs things out of words. I'm somebody who engages in a kind of historical, cultural activity. And that idea of being a storyteller, which of course you also discover as being a parent with your kids, was a very strong part of what shaped this book.
Mm-hmm. You do a very elite thing, writing novels, and your experience in America, very elite institutions, Princeton and Harvard Law. And when you go to New York and other cities, I assume you're staying with literary people.
Yeah.
Do you feel like you're in touch with the things in America that gave us Donald Trump, with the center of the country, with that side of America? Do you feel that you have experience of it and understand where it comes from?
Well, I have my views on it, I suppose, and I'm happy to talk about them. I think, for me, partly, when you travel a lot and you live in different places, you realize you're a little bit different from everyone. And initially that seems very strange. But then later, when you get older, sometimes you realize everybody feels this way, actually. Even people who've never moved feel a little bit weird and a little bit different from everyone. And then it becomes a way in, that actually everyone is going around feeling a bit weird. So I've just recognized this early, what a relief. And now let's deal with this person who's feeling a bit weird. And so, so there's the notion that people are not understandable or are fundamentally different from you as a category starts to fall apart. And I actually feel that I'm sort of open to all sorts of things. And living in Pakistan is also very interesting and useful in that sense, because in Lahore you're exposed to permutations of things that aren't so different from what you see in the United States, for example. Like, fake news is not new to us. A government run by people who are potentially enriching their own families is not new to us. Tribalism, a rejection of rationality, that we will not use reason. The notion that some people are more equal or more Pakistani than others. These are deep-seated Pakistani things also. So I think living in Lahore, weirdly, one has a vantage point on Trump-like American developments up close here in a way that one might not in New York. and I think that there are real similarities actually between Pakistan and America.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. What's the worst thing about being on book tour?
You know, I mean, I've always loved book tours. This is the first time I felt a little bit less than entirely excited, maybe because of the political climate, or maybe because probably what is the worst thing is, you know, being away from my family and my kids for so long. That actually is quite hard. I'm not used to going away for a month. A week is fine. It's disorienting in a way.
Do you enjoy reading your work aloud? Some writers don't.
Yeah, I do. I like to read my work aloud. I spend most of the time that I'm writing reading my work aloud. So a typical writing day for me, a few hours that I'm sitting in my study writing, there'll be some time of typing on my computer and deleting and retyping. But more than that, more than half the time, we'll be walking around my study with printouts of what I'm working on, reading it over and over again out loud. So mostly what I'm doing is actually reading my work out loud. I think that writing is a visual form in the sense that you read books with your eyes, but I think language is still processed by circuitry that your ears have privileged access to. So how something sounds is very important, and yeah, so I do read it aloud.
Would you encourage your daughters to write, to become writers?
I mean, well, not necessarily, but I'm not sure I have any choice in the matter because my 7-year-old daughter sort of already is. She's working on her first book and she composes these very dark and melancholic songs about darkness and loneliness and my heart. You know, she's 7. Yesterday somebody asked her, so why do you write such dark stuff? Like, what about happy stuff? He says, I think dark stuff sounds better. And,
she's a writer.
And it's easier. And that's true. Dark stuff does sound better, and it is a lot easier to write.
Did you have to worry similarly about offending anyone in your family when you started writing? There's some dark things in your novels, whether writing about sex or politics or anything that's, the complicated things in all of our lives. Well, not everyone is ready to read about them.
Well, it's not so much. But then I'd say I try to write my books in a way that allow me to be in the society in which I find myself. In other words, I try to find modes of expression that I think I can live with and that I think won't necessarily cause that kind of upset. I mean, that said, I write about drugs and sex and politics and religion and all sorts of things, but I try to find a way into something that I can sort of stand by, even if people will disagree with it. One of my father's grand uncle called me to see him after he read my first book, and he said, and he was an old retired Supreme Court judge, and he said, I've read your book. You've clearly gone after your mother's side of the family. And this was moth smoke. And but even in Pakistan as well, it's, if one lives in this country, you have to think about how does your writing work? How do you navigate being here and writing about these topics? And that's not new. Sufi poets have been doing this for 1,000 years. And writers everywhere have been doing this, I think.
I'm a terrific fan of books of writers' letters. Will there be a collection of your letters ever, or has email killed the literary letter?
Well, there certainly are still emails.
Or do you even email anymore, or is it just Snapchat? I don't know.
I do email and WhatsApp, in particular WhatsApp. Sometimes my friends and I get together, and there's 12 of us in a room, and mostly we're just WhatsApping each other while we're sitting together. But I think that there's like a kind of mutually assured destruction happening between us and Hall 2. We speak louder until we can drown each other out. But I write emails, and sometimes those emails are well thought out, and I receive very well thought out emails. But I kind of hope there isn't any record of that after I'm gone. I'd sort of like the books to stay and the rest of it to just disappear.
So there are no journals we'll read from you, or that
I
sort
hope
of thing?
not. I hope nobody gets their hands on
Are
anything.
you interested in nonfiction? Do you think you'd ever write a memoir?
Well, I've written, essays that are memoiristic, and in my essay collection, the first third, which is about my life, those essays are arranged not in the order they were written, but in the chronology of how old I was for the events that occur in that essay. So it's like a little bit like a memoir when you build it together, but it isn't a memoir, obviously. Yeah, I could certainly see writing a memoir. I'm a little nervous of doing it because I feel like I'd rather leave that stuff as to fertilize fiction for now. But yeah, at some point I could see doing it.
What writer have you met in your life you were most nervous of meeting because you admired them and just thought, my God, I'm meeting X?
Wow. There have been many. Let me think of who the writer I admired the most was. Well, in a strange way, maybe the writers I met when I was youngest were the ones that I was...
You studied with Toni Morrison,
yeah.
didn't you?
So, and with Joyce Carol Oates. And so I remember you had to, they each had fiction classes at Princeton, and you could submit a short story as an example, and they would decide whether to let you into the class, which have 5 or 6 or 7 students writing fiction. And, I remember when I first met them, it was kind of a very strange experience. I had loved books so much, and I knew writers in theory existed, but I hadn't really seen them physically manifest themselves before. So it would be like suddenly, discovering that, that there's a genie or something. So it was very strange.
What did Toni Morrison teach you, if anything? What did you take from her?
Toni Morrison probably taught 2 things above all. One is when she reads work, I think, better than anybody else I've ever met.
She was an editor, right?
Yeah.
Before she was a writer.
But she reads out loud. Well, it's strange because you do discover things about your book. I definitely learn about my books reading them out loud. There's things I might have written differently after I read the audiobook, cadences and rhythms that didn't work the way I thought they might have. And I was wondering why, because I read my stuff out loud a lot. And I realized that there's sort of, for me, 3 different kinds of reading out loud. There's reading out loud to myself to figure out whether I think something is working and what it's doing. There's reading out loud to an audience where there's some emotional reaction from the audience, at least you feel, and you're responding to in the reading. And then there's reading out loud to be recorded, not for yourself, but for an audience that isn't present, which is a very odd way of reading out loud. And so, it sometimes catches me flat-footed.
They're very intimate audiobooks. Do you find yourself ever listening to them?
I have listened to audiobooks, actually. It's tricky because you have to find the audiobook which is read the way you'd like it to be read. Films come very substantially pre-imagined. A lot of the imaginative work has been done for you in a film. Novels are the narrative form which come sort of least pre-imagined. It's a lot of imagining left for you to do to make this thing into something. And audiobooks have moved you one step closer towards the film in that a bit more pre-imagining has occurred in the voice of the reader. And I don't always appreciate that, but sometimes I listen to it.
In what ways have you changed in your own mind as a writer? Are there words you used in your first novel you look back and think you wince and to see that again? What are sort of some of the things you feel like you've left behind as a writer?
I don't know. I mean, in a way, I guess each novel is a kind of extended selfie, from different moments in your life. So the me who wrote Maud Smoke isn't me today. But I'm interested in that person. And I wouldn't write a novel like that now. But that person did, and, I'm perfectly happy that that person did.
Yep.
It's one thing which for me becomes apparent when I read books is that we are not one person. You know, we keep changing. And if you look at something like a book, which takes so much of your time and has so many of your words, you can see that. You can see that you aren't quite the same as when this happened.
Can you give us a taste of what you're thinking about next? Or maybe you're not. Many writers finish a novel and need to get started quickly on another novel. Other writers might go on a book tour and only then, when they return, start again. Do you have a seed?
I don't yet have the seed of the next novel. I thought I had some ideas, but I think political developments and other developments have slightly pushed those aside. I was interested for a long time in form. You know, how does a novel get built? What is it doing? How does it work? How can it interrogate in itself what novels do? I'm now a bit more interested in effectiveness.
In what?
Effectiveness.
Yes.
You know, like, how does this book do what I want it to do in the world? It's a different question. They're very closely related because the right form unlocks effectiveness, but form is starting to become, for me, more secondary than it was before. And that's a change. And specifically, I'm thinking about the idea that it's desperately important. He's singing us for 5 minutes. It's desperately important for us to begin to imagine the future, collectively, humanity to imagine the future in a hopeful way. Because if we don't, then the nostalgia and depression and pessimism that results makes us vulnerable to people like Donald Trump and to ISIS and to Brexit and to all of these sorts of things. Because since we can't imagine something that's likely to happen in the future that we would like to see happen, we want to go back into the past. And so what I'm thinking about now is, what do we as novelists, fiction writers, what do I as a novelist or fiction writer, how do I participate in that? And how can, like, a novelistic imagination, it doesn't have to be sci-fi, but engage with sort of where we're headed in an optimistic sense, even if it can be dark. That's increasingly important to me.
Okay. We talked about this a bit. When I talked to you personally about it. I know you get many offers to teach in the States, and would you consider moving back to the States for a year or 2 or 3 to teach? Do you think it's important for your daughters to move around as you did, or would you like to see them grow up, you know, primarily here? And as a writer, does it worry you to pick up and leave to be somewhere else?
You know, it maybe is because I moved around so much that I'm not so keen that my kids do it. I think it's good. I mean, but there's a certain degree of heartbreak involved in moving. Each time we move, we break our hearts a little bit. And
you have this line in the new novel, I won't get it right, but something about how we murder the people we leave, or something.
Yeah.
It's much stronger in the novel. But
yeah, we murder from our lives the people we leave behind.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think we feel that. So, I mean, so many people in this room who maybe had chances to live abroad are here in part because their parents are here, or their siblings are here, or somebody else is here, and because they just couldn't do it, you know, at some fundamental level. And not just in Pakistan, but in Trump's America, in these burnt-out Rust Belt towns. Why do people still live there? In part because of that feeling. And so it's difficult to move. I don't want to risk everything to prevent my kids from moving, and maybe I will move. But I don't take it lightly.
We're just about out of time. I'm sorry I haven't opened it to questions. I could talk to him all day. I find you're just enormously interesting. I've met so many people here who want to write. What do you tell young people? What are your core bits of advice that you can boil down? Just how does one do what you do? I mean, no one has your gift. Very few people. But what do you tell young writers about trying to make it?
You know, I mean, I think that for everybody who's a potential writer here, and all of us, you know, I guess, write somewhat. I mean, for me, figuring out whether your writing is working, I think reading out loud is my advice. Figuring out what writing can do, my advice is to read a lot of other people. Read whatever you love and some stuff you don't, and you will, all the knowledge you need is there. And the third one is that, writing is to take yourself out of your daily life and out of contact with other people and retreat into this isolated place. And it's a bizarre thing to do. For anybody to do what I do for a living and what you do for a living is weird. So if you think you want to write, figure out how badly you want to write. Some people don't want to badly enough, most people, and that's completely sane, actually. There's no reason to do it. But sometimes it keeps nagging at you, it keeps bothering you, it keeps staying there. And if so, then you have the compulsion, and then you should do it.
Great. Mohsin, thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming out. I enjoyed this enormously.
Thank you, Dwight.
Yeah.